Supplication. Please let me explain. There's nothing to explain. I continued packing, needing the mechanical activity to keep from collapsing completely. You asked me to lie to your son. I agreed. Now he knows and hates both of us. That's the entire story. I was trying to protect him. Her voice broke on the words. He'd just survived a coma. The doctors said emotional trauma could set back his recovery, might even be fatal given his weakened state. I made a choice based on what I thought would keep him alive. You made a choice that destroyed his trust in everyone around him. I zipped the suitcase with more force than necessary. That's not protection. That's manipulation disguised as love. I know. The admission came out as a sob. Isabella sank onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders shaking. I'd never seen her like this, stripped of the careful control that usually defined her. I know I was wrong. I've known for weeks, maybe months, but I didn't know how to stop it once it started. Didn't know how to tell him the truth without destroying everything. For a moment, I felt something like kinship with this woman who'd orchestrated my deception. We'd both been caught in a trap of our own making, both too cowardly to choose honesty when it might have mattered. He'll forgive you eventually, I said, picking up my suitcase. You're his mother. He loves you even when he hates what you've done. But me? I moved toward the door, forcing her to step aside. I'm just the woman who impersonated his dead fiancé. He'll never forgive that. Where will you go? My old apartment, if it's still available. If not, somewhere else. Anywhere that isn't here. Isabella reached out one last time, her hand catching my arm. I'm sorry. For all of it. For asking you to do this. For not stopping it sooner. For ruining your life along with my son's. I looked at her tear-stained face and felt empty of everything except exhaustion. I know you are. That doesn't change anything. I pulled away and walked out, leaving her crying in the room that had been my prison and my haven for nearly 3 months. Down the hallway where I'd learned to walk like my sister, past the dining room where I'd pretended to love pumpkin gnocchi, through the foyer where I'd first entered as a desperate, grieving woman and became something else entirely. Anthony was waiting by the front door. Of course he was. He'd probably been tracking this entire disaster from a distance, watching the consequences of his own choices unfold. You did the right thing, he said as I approached. Not taking any of her things. Starting clean. I didn't do the right thing for 3 months. I set down my suitcase to open the door myself. Don't pretend one moment of integrity erases everything that came before. Lorenzo will heal. He's stronger than you think. I hope you're right. And I did, despite everything. Despite the anger and hurt and betrayal. I genuinely hoped Lorenzo would recover from this new trauma. That he'd find someone real to love. Someone who wouldn't wear lies like jewelry. Take care of him. That was always the plan. I left without looking back, loading my pathetic single suitcase into the car and driving away from the mansion's gates. Away from Lorenzo's recovery rooms and Isabella's tears and Anthony's careful surveillance. Away from the life I'd borrowed and the ghost I'd been channeling. My old apartment building looked smaller than I remembered. Shabbier, the paint peeling near the entrance, and the hallway smelling like someone had burned dinner 3 days ago and never opened a window. But the super still had my key because I'd never officially moved out. Just quietly stopped coming home while I played dress-up in a world that was never mine. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Dust covered every surface. The plants I'd been growing on the windowsill were long dead. Mail had piled up behind the door where the super had been shoving it through the slot. Bills and advertisements and catalogs addressed to Lucia Moretti, proof that this person still existed even when I'd been pretending to be someone else. I dropped my suitcase just inside the door and collapsed onto the old sofa that had been here when I moved in. Too heavy for the previous tenant to bother removing. And then I cried. Not the pretty, delicate tears from movies. Ugly, gasping sobs that tore from my chest and left me shaking. I cried for Valentina, dead for months while I paraded around in her identity. Cried for Lorenzo, who'd woken from a coma to a carefully constructed lie. Cried for myself, for the person I'd been before agreeing to this deception, and would never be again. 3 days passed in a haze. I didn't eat, barely drank water, just moved between the sofa and the bed, sleeping in fragments and waking to the crushing weight of what I'd done. My phone buzzed constantly with messages I didn't read, calls I didn't answer. Probably Isabetta, possibly Anthony, not Lorenzo. Never Lorenzo. On the fourth morning, I finally forced myself upright. Showered for the first time since leaving the mansion. Made coffee that tasted like ash but at least contained caffeine. Looked at my reflection and saw a stranger. Not Valentina anymore, but not quite Lucia either. Someone caught between identities, belonging nowhere. I'd destroyed my own life along with Lorenzo's. That was the truth I had to live with now. The cost of playing guardian to someone who never asked for my protection. Of accepting Isabetta's desperate bargain. Of being too weak to confess before Anthony forced the issue. There was no going back. No way to undo the months of deception or restore the trust I'd helped destroy. I could only move forward into whatever future existed beyond this wreckage, carrying the weight of what I'd done like a scar that would never fully heal. Outside my window, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. People going to work, living their lives, completely unaware that mine had just ended in every way that mattered. And I sat alone in my tiny apartment wearing yesterday's clothes, too exhausted even for tears, wondering how anyone recovered from destroying themselves so thoroughly in the name of protecting someone else. By the end of the first week back in my apartment, I'd managed to establish a minimal routine. Wake up, stare at the ceiling, force down coffee, ignore my phone. The messages had slowed from a flood to a trickle, mostly Isabetta's increasingly desperate attempts to check if I was alive. I deleted them without reading past the first few words. The apartment felt smaller each day, the walls closing in like a trap I'd walked into voluntarily. I kept the curtains drawn, unable to face the city outside, or the memories of driving through it in Lorenzo's expensive car, wearing Valentina's clothes, pretending to be someone I'd never been. At 2:47 p.m. on the fourth day, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers had become synonymous with complications I couldn't handle, but something made me swipe to accept, some instinct that standing still was becoming more dangerous than movement. Hello? Is this someone from the Moretti family? The voice was male, accented with Mandarin inflections that turned certain syllables sharp and clipped. My entire body went cold. Who is this? A low chuckle came through the line, humorous in a way that made my skin crawl. That's not important. What matters is that we've been watching the Ricci mansion very carefully for weeks now. An informant inside their organization reported something interesting. The woman everyone thought was Valentina Moretti left the estate alone, looking upset, carrying a single suitcase. That suggested either a departure or an opportunity. I stood up without conscious decision, moving to the window. My hands shook as I pulled the curtain back just enough to see the street below. A black SUV sat parked directly in front of my building. Even from 3 floors up, I could see 2 men in dark suits standing beside it, looking up at my exact window. We have excellent researchers. The voice continued conversationally. Once we knew to look for Valentina Moretti's connections, finding her twin sister Lucia wasn't difficult. Public utility records show an apartment lease in your name. Very easy to locate once we knew you existed. What do you want? My voice came out steadier than I felt. Years of pretending to be confident finally serving a useful purpose. The triad has unfinished business with the Ricci family. Your boyfriend, or ex-boyfriend, or whatever he is now, he's been a problem for our operations. The attack 3 months ago was meant to eliminate that problem. Obviously, it didn't work. The casual tone made it worse somehow, discussing attempted murder like a failed business transaction. But we've learned that Lorenzo Ricci cares about the Moretti family. First Valentina, now you. That makes you valuable. I'm nobody to him anymore. The truth tasted bitter. You're wasting your time. Perhaps. But we'd like to test that theory. Consider this a courtesy call. We know where you are. We know you're alone. And we're coming up. The line went dead. I stared at the phone for 1 frozen second before my survival instincts kicked into gear. I had maybe minutes before they breached the building, and my apartment door had the kind of cheap lock that wouldn't slow down professionals for more than 30 seconds. There was only one number that could help me now, even though calling it felt like swallowing glass. Lorenzo answered on the second ring. What? Not a question. just flat acknowledgement. His voice held none of the warmth I'd grown accustomed to during his recovery, no softness for the woman who'd lied to him for months. The triad found me. The words tumbled out rapid fire, panic overriding pride. They called. They're outside my building right now. They said they're coming up and I don't know what to do, and I know you hate me, but please. Address. The single word cut through my spiral. Now. I rattled off the apartment number and building address. The information I'd written on dozens of forms and applications back when this place represented independence rather than a hiding spot. Lock every door and window. Stay away from anything with a sight line from outside. I'm sending people. He paused for half a breath. They'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone else. The call ended before I could thank him or apologize or do anything except follow his instructions. I locked the apartment door and pushed my pathetic sofa in front of it for good measure, knowing it wouldn't stop anyone determined but needing to feel like I was doing something. Checked the windows, made sure they were secure, then crouched in the bathroom with the door locked because it was the only room without external windows. 8 minutes later, I heard shouting from the hallway. Heavy footsteps. Commands delivered in voices that expected immediate obedience. Then silence, more terrifying than the noise had been. A knock on the door made me flinch so hard I hit my head on the bathroom wall. Lucia Moretti? A different voice. American accent. Professionally neutral. Lorenzo Ricci sent us. We're here to extract you to a secure location. I emerged from the bathroom on shaking legs, moving the sofa back enough to crack open the door. 4 men in tactical gear stood in my hallway, weapons visible but not pointed at me. Behind them, I could see my neighbors peeking out of doorways with expressions ranging from terror to fascination at the drama unfolding. Where are the men from the SUV? I asked, not moving from the relative safety of my doorway. Detained downstairs for questioning by local authorities. The lead man was built like he'd been carved from concrete, his expression completely neutral. Your building super called it in the moment he saw the force lock. They arrived fast. His gaze swept the corridor once, measuring exits and shadows like a habit. We need to move now. Bring nothing. We'll provide what you need. I grabbed my phone and wallet by reflex, then let them hustle me down the stairs with 2 men in front and 2 behind, a moving box of protection that felt claustrophobic and necessary in equal measure. Outside, 2 more black SUVs had replaced the triad's vehicle. They loaded me into the back of one, and we were moving before I'd even fastened my seatbelt. The drive took 40 minutes through traffic that the driver navigated with aggressive efficiency. We left Manhattan behind, crossed into New Jersey, drove through increasingly suburban neighborhoods until we reached a development that screamed upper-middle-class anonymity. The house they pulled up to looked exactly like its neighbors. 2 stories, neutral siding, landscaping maintained but not ostentatious. The kind of place you'd forget 5 minutes after driving past it. Perfect for hiding someone. They escorted me inside with the same professional efficiency, sweeping through rooms to ensure security before finally relaxing fractionally. The interior was furnished but impersonal, like a model home or an extended stay hotel. Clean surfaces, neutral colors, nothing that suggested actual people lived here. Lorenzo stood in the living room with his back to the door, looking out the window at the quiet street beyond. He'd lost weight, I realized, the suit hanging slightly wrong on his frame. His shoulders carried tension that hadn't been there even in the worst days of his physical therapy. Secure, one of the security team announced. Perimeter is clear. We'll maintain shifts around the clock. Lorenzo nodded without turning. The team dispersed to stations throughout the house, leaving us alone in the living room's carefully neutral space. Thank you, I said to his back, for sending them, for getting me out. Don't thank me yet. He finally turned, and the exhaustion on his face hit me like a physical blow. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and new lines had appeared around his mouth in just 4 days. This situation is complicated. I can leave. Go somewhere else. Somewhere they won't find me. There is nowhere they won't find you. He moved to the sofa and sat with the careful movements of someone conserving energy. The triad has been using my relationship with Valentina as leverage for months. The attack 3 months ago wasn't random violence. It was a targeted hit designed to eliminate both me and the woman they believed I loved, removing obstacles to their operations in one strike. I sank into the chair across from him, my legs finally giving out, but Valentina died. They won their leverage. That's what we thought too. Why they backed off after the attack. Assumed both of us were dead or broken. His dark eyes held mine with uncomfortable intensity. But someone inside my organization has been feeding them information. That informant reported that you left the mansion, that there was a twin, that you'd been pretending to be Valentina for months. Once they knew you existed, tracking you down through public records was trivial. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. So now I'm the leverage again. Now you're a liability they want to eliminate, and a tool they could potentially use against me. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something harder had settled into his expression. Which brings us to why you're here instead of somewhere else. Because you're protecting me. It felt presumptuous saying it out loud, assuming he'd extend protection to the woman who'd betrayed him so thoroughly. Because I won't let the Triad use another Moretti sister as a playing piece in their war with my family. The correction was sharp, deliberately cutting. This isn't about you specifically, Lucia. It's about not giving them weapons to use against us. That's pragmatic strategy, not sentiment. The words landed exactly as he'd intended them to, drawing clear lines between protection and caring, between what he was willing to do and what he was willing to feel. I nodded, swallowing around the lump in my throat. Understood. You'll stay here under security until we resolve this. 4 bedrooms. Team works in shifts. No external contact without clearance. There's food in the kitchen. Basic supplies in the bathrooms. You're not a prisoner, but you're not free to leave either. How long? Until I eliminate the threat. Or negotiate a truce that keeps you off their target list. He stood. The conversation apparently concluded in his mind. Try to stay out of the way. I have work to do. The first week at the safe house passed in strange, suspended animation. Lorenzo worked from a converted bedroom office, taking video calls and managing operations through encrypted channels I wasn't allowed to observe. The security team rotated through shifts with military precision, acknowledging me with nods, but no conversation beyond necessary communication. I existed in the negative space between captivity and safety, free to move through the house but trapped within its walls by threats I couldn't see. I read books from the surprisingly well-stocked shelves, cooked meals that Lorenzo ate mechanically when reminded, tried not to think about how my entire life had collapsed into this anonymous suburban prison. On the 8th night, everything changed. I couldn't sleep, restless energy making the bedroom feel claustrophobic. I wandered downstairs around 2 a.m. to find Lorenzo still working in his office, the blue light from multiple monitors painting his face in harsh angles. His door was cracked open, and I could hear him speaking in rapid Italian to someone on a call. I was about to retreat when I heard something else. A second conversation happening in the background of Lorenzo's call. Voices speaking what I initially thought was Italian, but resolved into Mandarin Chinese as I focused. My college degree had been in comparative literature with a focus on Asian languages. I'd loved it. Spent 4 years immersed in Chinese literature and culture before dropping out to help Valentina when her life had imploded. The language came back like muscle memory as I listened to the background conversation bleeding through Lorenzo's call. They were speaking in code, but it was cultural code. References to classical Chinese literature that would sound like nonsense to anyone who hadn't studied it extensively. The general prepares his horses at dawn wasn't about animals. It was a reference to a famous military strategy poem about surprise attacks at first light. They were planning something for dawn, something involving the Ricci family's operations. I knocked on the office door frame. Lorenzo's head snapped up, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. He held up a finger, finishing his call before addressing me. It's the middle of the night. That conversation your contact was having in the background. The Mandarin one. I moved into the office despite not being invited. They're planning an attack. Tomorrow at dawn. On your warehouse, I think, based on the reference to storing grain during winter. Lorenzo stared at me for 3 full seconds. You speak Mandarin. I studied Chinese literature in college. That wasn't casual conversation. It was coded military strategy hidden in classical references. The words tumbled out rushed as I tried to explain. The phrase about preparing horses at dawn, it's from Sun Tzu's commentaries. It means early morning attack. And the winter grain storage is probably literal, Your actual warehouse where you store shipments. He was already pulling up files on his computer, cross-referencing information I couldn't see. The Eastern warehouse. We have a major shipment coming in tomorrow, valuable enough that losing it would cost us millions, and political capital we can't afford to lose. Can you move it? Not in time. But I can be ready when they hit us. He pulled out his phone, started making calls with clipped efficiency. Anthony, we have credible intelligence about an attack on the Eastern facility. Dawn tomorrow. I need everyone available there in defensive positions by 5 a.m. I backed out of the office, letting him coordinate the response. My part was done. The small contribution I could make toward mitigating the chaos I'd helped create by existing. At dawn, Lorenzo left with half the security team, leaving me under guard with the remainder. The house felt emptier with him gone, more obviously a cage despite the comfortable furnishings. I spent the morning unable to focus on anything, jumping at every sound, wondering if my information had been accurate, or if I'd sent Lorenzo into danger based on half-remembered college courses. He returned at 2 p.m., exhausted, but satisfied. Blood spattered his shirt cuff, but he moved without favoring any injuries, so I assumed it wasn't his. Your intelligence was perfect, he said, accepting the coffee I'd made without being asked. They hit the warehouse at dawn exactly as you predicted. We were waiting. Took them completely by surprise. Anyone hurt? 2 of theirs dead. Several injured. We captured 2 of their mid-level people alive, lieutenants who were directing the operation. He drank the coffee in long gulps, needing the caffeine. That gives us leverage for negotiation. Over the next 3 days, Lorenzo orchestrated a truce with cold-blooded precision. The captured lieutenants became bargaining chips in video negotiations I was allowed to observe from just outside the frame. The Triad leadership wanted their people back. Lorenzo wanted guaranteed safety for anyone connected to the Ricci family, including by extension the Moretti sisters. The final video call happened on the 4th day after the warehouse attack. Lorenzo set up his laptop in the living room, positioning himself in the frame with professional precision. Then he gestured for me to join him. Stand here, he instructed, indicating a spot just to his left, close enough to be clearly visible, but slightly behind him, in a position that suggested both protection and ownership. The call connected to show 3 men in an elegant office somewhere I didn't recognize. The one in the center was clearly the leader, older than the others with silver threading his dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. Mr. Ricci, the man said with perfect English and minimal accent, you have something that belongs to us, and you've been trying to take something that belongs to me. Lorenzo's voice carried absolute authority, the tone of someone accustomed to commanding rather than requesting. I'm prepared to return your lieutenants unharmed in exchange for guaranteed cessation of all hostilities toward anyone connected to my family. Connected is a broad term. Then let me be specific. Lorenzo gestured toward me without looking away from the screen. This is Lucia Moretti. She's under my permanent protection. Any action taken against her or her family will be considered an act of war against the Ricci organization. Is that clear enough? The Triad leader's eyes moved to me, assessing and cataloging. The replacement sister. I'd heard rumors you'd been foolish enough to fall for her lies. What I fell for doesn't concern you. What concerns you is that touching her means war. A smile that held no warmth. You replace one Moretti sister with another like they're interchangeable parts. Very pragmatic, Mr. Ricci. I can respect that. Lorenzo's jaw tightened fractionally, but his voice remained controlled. Do we have an agreement? Return our people unharmed by midnight tonight. We'll withdraw all operations targeting your family, including the sisters. The leader leaned back in his chair. But Mr. Ricci, a word of advice. Be careful which ghosts you try to resurrect. Sometimes the replacement is more dangerous than the original. The call ended before Lorenzo could respond. The silence that followed felt weighted, full of things neither of us knew how to say. Lorenzo closed his laptop with deliberate care, then sat without moving for a long moment. Thank you, I said finally, for including me in the truce terms. Like I said, pragmatism, but his voice held less edge than it had before. Exhaustion bleeding through the careful control. You saved lives with that translation. My people. Potentially civilians if the attack had gone differently. That counts for something. It doesn't erase the months of lies. No. He looked at me directly for the first time since the video call. It doesn't. But maybe it's a first step toward understanding that you're more than just the lie you were asked to tell. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't absolution or restored trust, but it was acknowledgement, recognition that I existed as Lucia, separate from the ghost of Valentina. And in that moment, sitting in a safe house living room with coffee going cold on the table between us, it felt like the first honest thing that had passed between us since the day he woke from his coma. The truce with the triad, held through tense negotiations that stretched across the second week at the safe house. Lorenzo worked around the clock, coordinating with Anthony and other family members I heard but never saw, assembling the pieces of a deal that would keep everyone alive. I existed in the margins of that work, present but peripheral. The security team had relaxed fractionally after Lorenzo returned from the warehouse attack unharmed, but the house still felt like a fortress designed to keep the world out, and me contained within. On the third day after providing the translation that had saved the warehouse operation, Lorenzo emerged from his office around dinner time, looking more exhausted than I'd seen since his coma. He found me in the kitchen assembling sandwiches because cooking felt productive when nothing else did. "You don't have to do that," he said, leaning against the counter. "The team handles meals." I needed something to do with my hands. I finished cutting the sandwich and slid the plate toward him. "Turkey and Swiss. There's mustard if you want it." He took the plate without argument, too tired to maintain the careful distance he'd been preserving. We ate in silence for several minutes. The only sound, the quiet hum of the refrigerator and distant voices from the security team's shift change. "The translation you provided," Lorenzo said eventually, setting down his half-eaten sandwich. "The way you decoded their references to classical literature and military strategy. That wasn't something you learned casually. I studied Chinese literature for 4 years in college. Comparative literature with a focus on East Asian cultures. The words came easier than expected, talking about the life I'd abandoned so long ago. I was good at it. My professors said I had a natural ear for linguistic patterns. What happened? Why drop out if you were succeeding? The question I'd been dreading. Not because I didn't want to answer, but because the answer revealed so much about the sister he'd lost and never fully known. Valentina needed help. Her boyfriend at the time got her pregnant and then disappeared when she told him. She was terrified, alone, drowning in medical bills when she miscarried at 4 months. Lorenzo went very still, his sandwich forgotten on the plate. Valentina was pregnant. You didn't know. It wasn't a question. I could see the shock and pain radiating from him in waves. She never told you. We weren't together yet when that happened. We met 2 years ago, but if she was pregnant before that... He ran a hand through his hair. A gesture of frustration I'd learned meant he was processing something difficult. Why wouldn't she tell me later, when we got serious? I think she was ashamed. Not of the pregnancy itself, but of how alone she'd been. How completely that guy had abandoned her when she needed him most. I moved around the kitchen island, needing distance from the pain I was causing. She told me she never wanted to be that vulnerable again. Never wanted to need someone so desperately that losing them would destroy her. So she built walls. Lorenzo's voice had gone quiet, introspective, kept parts of herself separate. I always thought she was just independent, that she valued her privacy. I didn't realize she was protecting herself from being hurt again. She loved you. That was real. But the parts of herself she kept hidden, those were real too. I hesitated, then added, "I'm not sure you knew her as completely as you thought you did. I'm not sure anyone did." He processed this in silence, his dark eyes distant with thoughts I couldn't read. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight of realization. "You gave up your education to help her through that. Dropped out to work and cover her medical bills. She was my sister, my twin. We'd shared everything since before we were born. How could I not help her when she needed me? And then she built a life you weren't part of." There was no judgment in his tone, just observation. Met me, got engaged, kept her apartment in Manhattan separate from the family she'd come from. Left you behind. The words stung because they were true. Valentina had climbed out of the hole that pregnancy and abandonment had dug. And she'd done it by creating distance from everything that reminded her of being vulnerable, including me. She didn't mean it as rejection, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed that completely. She was trying to become someone new. someone who couldn't be hurt the way she'd been hurt before. But it left you working 2 jobs to pay rent on an apartment you could barely afford, while she wore designer clothes and planned a wedding that probably cost more than you made in a year. Lorenzo stood, pacing to the window with restless energy. I gave her everything she wanted. Money, status, protection. And I never knew she had a twin sister struggling to survive. She kept us separate on purpose. I think she was afraid that if you knew too much about where she came from, you'd see her differently. As less than the polished woman she'd worked so hard to become. He turned to face me, and something in his expression had shifted. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. The woman I loved was more complicated than I gave her credit for, and the woman who's been pretending to be her is someone completely different than I assumed. I'm not her. I never was, even when I was trying my hardest to be. No, you're not. He moved back to the counter, finishing his sandwich with mechanical efficiency. You're the sister who sacrificed her future to help family, who learned languages because you genuinely loved them, not because they were useful tools, who translated enemy communications in the middle of the night and probably saved lives without expecting anything in return. The assessment felt too generous, like he was building me into someone better than I actually was. I'm also the person who lied to you for months, who wore your dead fiancé's face and let you believe in something that wasn't real. Yes, you're that too. The acknowledgement hurt more than anger would have. I don't know how to reconcile those things yet. The woman who helped me versus the woman who betrayed me. Maybe they're the same person. Maybe they're not. I'm still figuring it out. Over the following weeks, an unexpected pattern emerged. Lorenzo would work in his office for hours, then emerge seeking conversation rather than solitude. We'd talk about inconsequential things at first. Books on the safe house shelves, news from the outside world, the way the security team played cards during their downtime. But gradually, the conversations deepened. 3 weeks into our forced proximity, during a late evening when exhaustion had stripped away our usual defenses, Lorenzo told me about growing up knowing his entire life was predetermined. How his father had died when Lorenzo was 19, thrusting him into leadership before he was ready. How Anthony had wanted to take over, but family tradition dictated the role go to the younger brother, who'd been groomed for it since birth. I never had a choice, he said, staring into whiskey he'd poured but barely touched. Not about the business, not about the violence that comes with it, not about building my entire identity around being the boss everyone feared. It was just what I was, what I had to be. Did you ever want something different? I asked from my position on the opposite sofa, maintaining the physical distance we'd wordlessly agreed upon. Every day for the first 5 years. Then I stopped wanting it because wanting things you can't have is torture. He took a small sip of whiskey, grimacing slightly. Valentina understood that, I think. She'd also built herself into someone she had to be rather than someone she wanted to be. That's part of why we worked. We were both performing versions of ourselves that the world demanded. And now I'm tired of performing. 3 months in a coma gives you perspective on what matters and what's just theater. He set down his glass with a soft click against the table. I'm trying to figure out how to be Lorenzo Ricci without the costume. It's harder than it sounds. I shared my own version of the same struggle. Growing up as Valentina's twin, always the quieter one, the less vibrant one. The one people forgot was in the room. How I'd gotten used to being second choice, to taking up less space, to making myself smaller so my sister could shine brighter. She was the sun, and I was the moon, I said, wrapping my hands around the tea I'd made. People only noticed me when she wasn't around to outshine me, and I accepted that as just how things were. Like you accepted being the boss. We both got used to roles that didn't fit quite right, but you fought your way out of that role when you dropped out to help her. That took courage, or stupidity. The line between them is thinner than people think. He smiled at that, a real smile that reached his eyes for the first time since the apartment confrontation. Maybe. But I'm starting to think stupidity motivated by love is just another word for loyalty. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted between us. Not forgiveness, not restored trust, but recognition. We saw each other more clearly than before, stripped of the masks we'd both been wearing for different reasons. On the 25th day at the safe house, Lorenzo appeared in the living room late one night, looking more troubled than usual. I'd been reading, unable to sleep, and looked up at the sound of his footsteps. "I need to visit Valentina's grave," he said, without preamble. "I haven't been since before the accident. Keep putting it off because I don't know what to say to her." He paused, then added, "Would you want to come? You don't have to. But if you wanted to say goodbye properly, this would be the chance." The offer surprised me. Including me in something so personal felt like an invitation across the distance he'd been maintaining. "Yes, I'd like that." We drove the next morning with 2 security vehicles flanking us, a convoy of protection moving through early traffic toward the cemetery where Valentina had been buried 3 months ago. I'd attended the funeral from a distance, watching from my car as the Ricci family and Valentina's society friends said goodbye to someone they'd thought they knew. The cemetery was exactly what I'd expected. Manicured lawns, marble headstones, the quiet pretension of money extending even into death. Lorenzo led the way to a plot beneath a maple tree, its leaves just starting to turn with the changing season. The headstone was elegant, simple, Valentina Moretti, with dates that bracketed a life too short and more complicated than anyone had realized. Lorenzo stood silent for a long moment, holding white flowers he'd bought along the way. When he finally spoke, it was in Italian, words I understood from my months of desperate study. He was asking forgiveness for not protecting her, for failing to see the attack coming, for surviving when she hadn't. I waited until he stepped back before placing my own offering, a letter I'd written in the pre-dawn hours, trying to articulate an apology that could never be adequate. I'd sealed it in waterproof plastic so the rain wouldn't destroy it, then tucked it against the base of the headstone, where flowers and time would eventually cover it. We cried separately, standing meters apart, mourning the same person from different angles. Lorenzo had lost his future. I'd lost my past. And neither of us could undo the fact that she was gone. On the drive back, Lorenzo broke the silence. "My mother has been calling. 10 times this week, maybe more. She wants to apologize, explain why she orchestrated everything. Will you answer? Eventually. She's my mother. I can't hate her forever even though part of me wants to right now." His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "But I can't look at her yet without feeling betrayed, without wondering what else she'd be willing to lie about to protect me. I understand that feeling." I stared out the window at the suburbs rolling past. I feel the same way about myself. Looking in mirrors is complicated these days. "We're quite a pair," he said with dark humor. "Both of us betrayed by people we trusted. Both of us trying to figure out how to exist after everything fell apart. At least we're consistent in our dysfunction." That earned another small smile. There's something to be said for symmetry. 4 weeks after the warehouse attack, Lorenzo summoned me to his office with the formal tone he used for business, rather than the casual conversations we'd fallen into. I entered to find him behind his desk, every inch the crime boss rather than the exhausted man I'd been talking to late at night. "The truce with the triad is holding," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "Our intelligence suggests they're satisfied with the terms and have moved their focus to other territories, which means you're no longer in immediate danger." Relief, and something that felt uncomfortably like disappointment warred in my chest. "That's good news. It means you can return to a normal life, not your old apartment. That's too exposed and they know the location. But I've arranged for a secure building with monitoring, top-floor unit with good sight lines and controlled access." He slid a folder across the desk. "Lease is already paid for 6 months. There's also a security stipend to cover monitoring costs and any other necessities." I opened the folder to find apartment details and financial information that was far more generous than necessary. "Lorenzo, I can't accept." "You can, and you will. You risked your life because of my family's enemies. The least I can do is ensure you're safe and comfortable going forward." His tone left no room for argument. "There's also information about a language services company that's looking for contractors with Mandarin skills. I may have mentioned your qualifications to their hiring manager. You're setting me up with a job? I'm providing a reference. What you do with it is your choice." He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time I saw uncertainty beneath the professional facade. "You don't belong here, Lucia. In this house, in my world, in the life you were pretending to live. You deserve the chance to build something real, something that's actually yours." The dismissal was clear. wrapped in generosity but ultimately a door closing. He was giving me freedom because he didn't want the reminder of what I'd done, the walking evidence of months of deception. I understood it intellectually, even as it carved something hollow in my chest. When do I leave? Whenever you're ready. Tomorrow, next week. The apartment is available now. I stood, taking the folder with its promise of a new life built on foundations I hadn't earned. Thank you. For everything. For saving me. For the apartment. For the job reference. For not hating me as much as you have every right to. I'm working on not hating anyone, he said quietly. It takes too much energy, and I need all I have for figuring out what comes next. What does come next? For you? I don't know yet. That's the terrifying part. He looked at me directly, and in his dark eyes I saw the same uncertainty I felt every morning. But I know it starts with truth. No more performances, no more becoming what other people need me to be. Just figuring out who Lorenzo Ricci actually is underneath all the masks. I hope you find him, the real version. He's probably worth knowing. Same to you. Lucia Moretti without the costumes. I suspect she's more interesting than the ghost she was pretending to be. I left his office with the folder clutched in my hands, and the weight of goodbye settling over everything. The safe house that had been my prison and sanctuary would become just another place I'd lived briefly. Another chapter in the fragmented story of a life I was still learning how to live honestly. I moved into the secured apartment 2 days later, carrying the same single suitcase I'd fled the Ricci mansion with weeks ago. The building was everything Lorenzo had promised. Controlled access, security cameras covering every angle, a top-floor unit with windows that looked out over the city rather than facing other buildings where snipers could position themselves. The space was furnished in that same impersonal way the safe house had been. Neutral colors and functional pieces that suggested no one's actual taste. But it was mine. My name on the lease, my key in the lock. My life to rebuild however I chose. I'd taken the folder Lorenzo provided about the language services company, made the call. Had an interview that went better than expected when I demonstrated my Mandarin fluency and explained my academic background. They hired me as a contractor within a week. Translation work I could do remotely without committing to an office where my past might catch up with me. It wasn't the career I'd dreamed about in college, but it was honest work using skills I'd actually earned rather than stolen from my sister's life. That counted for something. The first 2 weeks alone felt like learning to breathe in a different atmosphere. No security team rotating through shifts. No Lorenzo emerging from his office at odd hours seeking conversation. Just me and the quiet apartment, and the work that filled my days with purpose, even when it couldn't fill the hollow spaces grief and guilt had carved out. Isabetta called on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was reviewing a particularly complex technical translation. I almost didn't answer, seeing her name on the screen and feeling my stomach clench with remembered shame. But avoiding her forever wasn't possible, and maybe not even what I wanted. Lucia. Her voice came through thick with emotion. Thank you for answering. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure I would either, I admitted, setting aside my work. How are you? Terrible. Better. I don't know. A shaky breath. I'm calling to apologize. Not because it will fix anything, but because you deserve to hear it from me directly. What I asked you to do, what I convinced you was necessary, it was selfish. I prioritized Lorenzo's physical recovery over every other consideration, including the damage it would do to both of you when the truth came out. You were trying to protect your son. I was trying to control an outcome I had no right to control. Her voice broke completely. I thought I could manage the situation, that I could create a safe space for Lorenzo to heal and then reveal the truth gently once he was strong. But I underestimated how long it would take, how complicated the deception would become, how much it would cost everyone involved. I moved to the window, looking out at the city and remembering all the times I'd stood in similar windows at the mansion, wearing Valentina's clothes and pretending to be someone I wasn't. We both made choices we can't undo. We both have to live with what those choices cost. Lorenzo is speaking to me again, Isabetta continued. Not often. Not with the warmth we used to have. But he answers my calls now. Agreed to have dinner last week. We're rebuilding trust one painful conversation at a time. Something in my chest loosened slightly. I'm glad. He needs his family, even when he's angry at them. He needs you too, though he might not realize it yet. Before I could protest, she continued. Not as Valentina's replacement, as Lucia, as the woman who helped him recover, even though she was drowning in guilt the entire time. That person matters, regardless of the lies she was asked to tell. I don't know if he sees it that way. Give him time. Lorenzo processes things slowly, but when he comes to conclusions, they're usually the right ones. She paused, then added softly, I hope you can forgive me, Lucia. Not today necessarily, but someday. I hope we can find a way past what I asked you to do. I thought about it, really thought about whether forgiveness was possible. Isabetta had manipulated me, yes, had used my grief and desperation and love for my sister to orchestrate an elaborate deception. But she'd also been a mother terrified of losing her son, making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. I forgive you, I said, and was surprised to find I meant it. I understand why you did it, even if I wish you hadn't. We were both trying to protect Lorenzo in our own misguided ways. That has to count for something, she cried then, relief and gratitude pouring through the phone in barely coherent words. We talked for another 20 minutes, cautiously rebuilding a connection that had been based on lies, but maybe didn't have to stay that way. When we finally hung up, I felt lighter somehow, as if forgiving her had also created space to forgive myself, just slightly. 1 month and 3 days after leaving the safe house, someone knocked on my apartment door at 7 in the evening. I checked the security camera feed on my phone before answering, a habit Lorenzo's people had drilled into me during the weeks of active threat. Lorenzo stood in my hallway holding flowers. My heart did something complicated and painful in my chest. I opened the door slowly, taking in his appearance with the kind of attention you give to something you thought you'd lost. He looked better than he had at the safe house. The weight he'd lost during his coma and its aftermath had started to return. The exhaustion that had been carved into his features had softened into something more manageable. He wore casual clothes, jeans, and a dark sweater, looking more human and less like the crime boss who'd orchestrated truces and ordered operations. These are for you, he said, holding out the flowers. They were coral-colored, unusual and beautiful, nothing like the traditional roses that would have felt loaded with implications. I didn't know what you liked, so I asked the florist for something that felt like new beginnings. I took the flowers, their stems cool against my palms. They're perfect. Do you want to come in? He entered with the careful movements of someone navigating unfamiliar territory, looking around the apartment I'd been living in for a month. It's nice. Better than that place you were in before, at least from the security assessment. Much better. The job you helped me get pays well enough that I could have afforded something decent on my own, but this is definitely an upgrade. I found a vase under the sink and started arranging the flowers, needing something to do with my hands. How are you? How's the restructuring going? Slowly. Convincing old school members that we need to move away from certain activities is like trying to turn an ocean liner with a canoe paddle. But Anthony supports the changes, and together we're making progress. He settled on the edge of the sofa. Not quite relaxed, but not as rigid as he'd been. I've been thinking about what Valentina used to say, about legitimacy, about building something that didn't require violence as its foundation. I dismissed it then because I thought she was being naive. Now I'm starting to think she was just seeing clearer than I was. She'd be proud of you for trying. Maybe. Or maybe she'd point out I should have listened years ago instead of waiting until I nearly died to take her seriously. He pulled a small box from his jacket pocket and set it on the coffee table between us. I brought you something else. I sat across from him, leaving the safety of distance, and picked up the box. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, was the platinum ring I'd worn for 3 months. Valentina's engagement ring. The symbol of everything I'd pretended to be. It belongs to her memory, Lorenzo said quietly. Not to you, not to anyone else. I had it cleaned and reset in its original box. But I wanted you to see it one more time, to understand something. What? That I know why you accepted my family's request. You weren't trying to hurt me or steal Valentina's place. You were trying to help, in the only way they gave you to help. And while I'm still processing the betrayal, I'm starting to understand the impossible position you were in." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "This ring represents a promise I made to someone who's gone. But maybe it's time to stop living in that past and figure out what the future could look like." I closed the box carefully, the weight of it somehow both heavy and liberating. "What does that mean?" "It means I'd like to take you to dinner. Not as an obligation, not because of security concerns or family pressure. Just as two people who've been through something terrible together and might want to see if there's anything worth building on the other side." His dark eyes held mine, vulnerable in a way I'd only seen during his worst moments of recovery. "I want to know who Lucia Moretti is when she's not pretending to be anyone else. If you're willing to show me." The invitation hung between us, weighted with possibility and risk in equal measure. This was a chance to start over, to build something real from the wreckage of what we'd both lost. But it was also terrifying, exposing myself to someone who'd seen me at my absolute worst and had every reason to never trust me again. "Yes," I said, because the alternative was letting fear make my decisions for the rest of my life. "I'd like that. I'd like to see who we both are when we're not wearing masks." "Saturday? There's a restaurant in Brooklyn. Small place that doesn't cater to the usual crowd. We could just be two people having dinner. Saturday works." He stood, and I walked him to the door. Before leaving, he paused in the doorway. "This won't be easy. I can't promise I've completely forgiven you, or that I won't have moments where the betrayal hits me fresh. But I think we both deserve the chance to figure out if there's something real here, underneath all the lies and trauma. I'll take complicated and real over simple and false any day." A small smile touched his lips. "Good. That's what we've got." The dinners became weekly rituals over the next 3 months. We met at different restaurants, always in neighborhoods where Lorenzo's reputation didn't precede him, places where we could talk without performing for audiences who expected certain behavior from a crime boss and his companion. We talked about everything except the immediate past, giving ourselves space to be people rather than victims of circumstance. Lorenzo told me about his plans to restructure the family business, moving resources toward legitimate enterprises and slowly extracting them from the violent operations that had defined previous generations. It was work that would take years and came with resistance from all sides. But he was committed to honoring what Valentina had asked for, even if she'd never see the results. I told him about returning to school online, taking literature courses again after so many years away from academia, about the satisfaction of translation work, the puzzle of making meaning transfer across languages and cultures, about slowly rebuilding a life that felt like mine rather than something borrowed or stolen. We avoided the minefield of what had happened between us, not out of cowardice, but strategic patience. Some wounds needed time before they could be examined without causing more damage. 3 months into our weekly dinners, Lorenzo picked me up at my apartment with a nervousness I'd never seen in him before. We'd fallen into comfortable patterns by then, easy conversation and careful boundaries. But tonight felt different somehow. The restaurant was one we'd been to before, a quiet Italian place where the owner knew Lorenzo, but didn't make a fuss about his presence. We ordered food we barely tasted, both of us dancing around something neither knew how to say directly. "I've been seeing a therapist," Lorenzo said halfway through the meal, setting down his fork with deliberate care. "Anthony suggested it months ago, and I finally took his advice. Trying to process everything that happened, the coma, the lies, losing Valentina, all of it. How's that going?" "Slowly. Painfully. Productively, I think." He took a sip of wine, organizing his thoughts. "One thing we talk about a lot is the difference between the person I was with Valentina and the person I am now. How trauma changes you in ways you can't undo, and maybe that's not entirely bad." "What do you mean?" "The man who got engaged to your sister was performing a role. The powerful boss, the controlled leader, the person who had everything figured out. I thought that's what she wanted, what everyone wanted, but that person was exhausting to be. And I'm not sure he was particularly real." He looked at me directly. "The person I am now, after everything. He's messier, more uncertain, but maybe more honest. I like this version," I said quietly. "Messy and uncertain beats polished and fake. That's what I'm hoping." He reached across the table, palm up, an invitation rather than a demand. I placed my hand in his, feeling the calluses from his physical therapy and the warmth that still sent electricity through my nervous system. "Lucia, I need to ask you something important." My heart rate kicked up. "Okay. These last 3 months, getting to know you as yourself rather than as Valentina's echo, it's been the most honest thing in my life. You don't perform for me. Don't tell me what you think I want to hear. You just exist as Lucia, with all your complications and flaws and strengths. And it's—" he paused, searching for words. "It's what I didn't know I needed. Lorenzo, let me finish." His thumb traced circles on the back of my hand. "I can't promise I'm completely over what happened. Can't say there won't be moments where I remember the betrayal and feel it fresh. But I'm starting to understand that you were as much a victim of my family's choices as I was. And more importantly, I'm starting to care about who you are separate from all of that." "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'd be willing to try this for real. Not dinner as friends, not careful conversations where we avoid the past, but an actual relationship where we figure out together what we could be." His eyes held mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "I'm asking if you'll be my girlfriend. Not my fiancé, not a replacement for someone I lost. Just Lucia, the woman I'm choosing right now, in this moment, with full knowledge of everything we've been through." The question hung between us, loaded with possibility and risk. This was everything I'd been afraid to want, offered freely by someone who had every reason to keep his distance. It was terrifying and perfect, and more than I'd thought I deserved. "Yes," I said, and watched relief flood his expression. "Yes, I want to try. I want to see what we could build when it's real from the start." He stood and moved to my side of the table, pulling me up and into a kiss that tasted like wine and promises and new beginnings. It was different from that first kiss in the therapy room months ago, that test of recognition and memory. This was acknowledgement. Two people choosing each other with clear eyes and honest intentions. When we pulled apart, both of us were smiling. Not the careful expressions we'd been wearing for months, but genuine joy at taking a risk together. "This might be a disaster," I said, resting my forehead against his. "Probably. But it'll be our disaster, built on truth instead of lies. I'll take those odds." Our first official date as a couple happened the following weekend. Lorenzo insisted on picking me up properly, bringing more coral flowers, and wearing what he called his attempting to be a normal boyfriend outfit. We went to a movie neither of us could later remember the plot of, too aware of each other's presence to focus on the screen. Afterward, at a diner that served breakfast food 24 hours a day, we ran into Anthony. It wasn't a coincidence, I realized, seeing the way Lorenzo's brother appeared with perfect timing. He'd been informed where we'd be, probably asked to show up as a gesture of family approval. "Lucia." Anthony's greeting was formal, but warmer than I'd heard from him before. "Good to see you looking well." "You too. Thanks for everything. For giving Lorenzo space to figure things out. For not pushing when pushing would have made things worse. He's my brother. Pushing him never works." Anthony settled into the booth across from us, ordering coffee when the waitress appeared. "For what it's worth, I think you're good for him. He's different with you. More himself. Less the role everyone expects him to play. That's what I'm hoping for both of us," Lorenzo said, his hand finding mine under the table. "Room to be ourselves without the weight of other people's expectations. Speaking of expectations, Mother wanted me to pass along that she'd love to have you both for dinner next week. If you're ready for that." Anthony's tone made it clear the choice was truly theirs, no pressure being applied. "She's been working on her own recovery, facing what she did and why. I think seeing you two together, happy, would mean a lot to her." Lorenzo looked at me, the question clear in his eyes. "What do you think?" "I think we're strong enough to handle that," I said, surprising myself with the certainty. "And I think she deserves to see that something good came from all the mistakes we all made." We went to that dinner the following Thursday. Isabella cried when she saw us arrive together, holding hands, clearly more than just cordial acquaintances. She'd aged in the months since I'd last seen her in person. The stress of nearly losing her son, and then betraying him, carving new lines into her elegant face. But there was also relief there. Gratitude that her family was slowly healing. The meal was easier than I'd expected. We talked about neutral topics at first, gradually working our way toward harder subjects. Isabetta apologized again, this time to both of us together, acknowledging the damage her choices had caused. Lorenzo accepted with more grace than I'd thought possible, explaining that forgiveness was a process, but he was working on it. Anthony made dry jokes that cut tension when it threatened to rise too high. By dessert, we were almost relaxed. 4 people who'd been through trauma together, and were tentatively figuring out how to be family again. 6 months after the day Lorenzo had appeared at my apartment with coral flowers, he asked me to be his girlfriend officially during one of our walks through the park near my building. It was a warm evening, the kind where the city felt almost peaceful, and we'd been discussing his latest success in moving a major portion of the family business into legitimate territory. "We're really doing this," he said, not quite a question. "Building something real on ruins of something false. Yes, we're really doing this. It's terrifying. Completely." I squeezed his hand. "But it's also the most honest thing I've ever done. For the first time in my life, someone sees all of me, knows all the worst things I've done, and still chooses to stay. That's worth being terrified for." "Same," he said simply. "You're worth the fear." We weren't a fairy tale. Lorenzo still ran an empire that operated in moral gray areas I tried not to examine too closely. I still carried the weight of months spent living a lie. Guilt that woke me some nights with Valentina's face behind my eyelids. We both had scars that would never fully heal, damage that marked us permanently. But we were real, finally, completely, undeniably real. 2 people who'd been broken by impossible circumstances, and were slowly teaching each other how to be whole again, not by forgetting what had happened, but by choosing to build something new from the pieces that remained. It wasn't the ending either of us had imagined. But standing in that park with Lorenzo's hand in mine, the city lights coming on as evening settled, I realized it was better than anything I'd dared to hope for during those desperate months of deception. We were Lucia and Lorenzo. Not echoes of other people, not performances for audiences who expected certain behaviors. Just ourselves, messy and complicated, and trying our best to be honest in a world that rewarded lies. And somehow, impossibly, that was more than satisfactory. It was everything.